program is brought to you by Newsworks in cooperation with the Eau Claire Area School Board.
So we are right at 6:30. I am just looking to see if Commissioner Harder is on the call. I haven't brought up the, there he is right there. Hello, Commissioner Harder. So we'll call this to order. Beta, can you confirm that we're in compliance with our open meeting laws?
Yes, we are.
And then will you please conduct a roll call?
Commissioner Harder?
Here.
Commissioner Johnson?
Here.
Commissioner Lyons?
Here.
Commissioner Nordin?
Here.
Commissioner Zur? Commissioner Bika?
Here.
Commissioner Clements?
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Our first order of business is closed session tonight. I would hear a motion to adjourn to closed session under section 19.851C, considering employment and compensation of any public employee. We'll be talking about the superintendent compensation for the upcoming year. So I'd like to hear that motion, please.
So moved.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstaining? All right, we'll go to closed session. We intend to reconvene at around 7. We'll call the meeting back to order. At this time, those who are willing and able, please rise and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance. I, States of America. The Republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. I'll move on to the adoption of the agenda for the night. I would hear a motion to adopt the agenda.
Second.
Moved and seconded. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed? The motion passes. We'll move on to our recognitions for the evening, and I'll turn it over to Superintendent Johnson.
Good evening, Chair Nordin, Vice Chair Bika, Commissioners, and Executive Team members. I have 4 items this evening for recognition. The first, recently, Ms. Tyra Perrine, Special Education Teacher at Putnam Heights, received the Lewandowski Award for Humanitarian Activities. Ms. Perrine was selected for the honor by a committee of Wisconsin public school educators. This prestigious award preserves and honors the memory of Richard J. Lewandowski by recognizing and encouraging the involvement of WEAC members and affiliates in humanitarian efforts. Tyra has helped grow our Leaders for Just Schools program through the Eau Claire Area School District for the past few years, recruiting over 20 educators to build more equitable schools. In partnership with educators and school leaders, large-scale changes were initiated during ensuring there are at least 2 equity leaders in each district building. She was nominated on behalf of the WEAC Human and Civil Rights Committee for her exceptional commitment to all students. Tyra has been on the forefront of equity work in the ECASD, and her continued leadership in this very important area of work is worthy of recognition. We're so appreciative of Tyra's passion and commitment. Congratulations to Tyra. The second item, this spring, Robbins Elementary installed 2 communication boards. These boards were put together by Shannon Malone, speech and language pathologist, and supported by the Robbins PTO. The communication boards include many pictures which nonverbal students may point to in order to more easily communicate with peers and adults. Words including yes, no, what, where, stop, go, hi, play, together, run, and help are depicted on the boards. One of the communication boards is located on the Robbins Playground to help students communicate and make recess more fun and inclusive for all. It's an outstanding opportunity for all students to learn from this inclusive act. Thirdly, this year, the South Special Education ID students, led by Shelley LaBar, had a very successful growing season in the greenhouse. They had grown a variety of plants, flowers, and vegetables, including petunias, morning glories, cherry and beefeater tomatoes, and marigolds. Something new for South this year was starting plants from cuttings. They were able to propagate spider plants and 2 types of ivy, for example. This spring, they were in the process of cleaning out the greenhouse and finishing up the annual plant sale. All plants were $1 a piece, with all proceeds going to buy seeds and soil for next year. We invite administration and board at South to come and tour our greenhouses next year to see what new gardening adventures we're up to. Thank you and congrats to the South Middle Special Education Department. A final recognition was shared from our Cohort C administrators. One of the things we've noticed this year is the incredible amount of growth our 100% virtual teachers have shown. Of all those impacted by the pandemic, those who shifted to 100% virtual surely had some heavy lifting. We wanted to recognize this as a board meeting this evening for their difficult and rewarding work for our students at such a time of need. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll just take a minute on behalf of the board to say thank you to all of our district staff from the school level all the way up through the district level, and you too, Superintendent Johnson, for your work throughout this year as we've closed out the 2020-2021 school year with a lot of positives, graduations, and other celebrations. The board is appreciative, grateful, and indebted to the work that is done for our district by the staff here. So thank you for that. We'll move on now to our public forum. We have one person signed up for our public forum tonight. People signed up for public comment will be allowed 4 minutes to address the board. And the school board does not hear personal complaints of school personnel or any person connected with the school system in a public forum. Tonight we have, as I said, one person. That is Maggie Vinipol. Ms. Vinipol, please state your name and address for the record. Welcome.
Hi, good evening, board members. Thank you for allowing me to speak. My name is Maggie Vinipol. I live at 3409 Briarcrest Drive. First of all, I just wanted to address, sorry, my notes are not as concise as normal between this meeting and the city council meeting going on. It's been a chaotic day, but anyway, I wanted to address public comment. I'm really hoping that here in the upcoming weeks and months, weeks preferably, we could get back to a live in-person public comment. There was stats that were recently put out, and thankfully Eau Claire is doing such a great job that Eau Claire has now been placed and ranked in 52 out of 72 counties in Eau Claire. So awesome job, Eau Claire County doing a great job controlling COVID. We had 39 cases in the past 14 days, which is 2.8 cases per day. So awesome job. And myself as a parent and speaking for other parents in the area, we really hope that we get to address you all in person and get back to face-to-face communication with you. I also wanted to thank you all for, and also Superintendent Johnson for a great end to the school year. My daughter goes to South and they did great work at the end of the school year. Thank you so much to Mr. Kolup. My daughter had an excellent last few months of school and a great last day of school. So thank you so much for that. Thank you also for making changes to the mask policy for the summer school, allowing parents to make the choice for masks to be optional. That really, I think, is a step in the right direction and gives us parents some confidence into allowing us to make the decisions for what we think is best for our kids. I did just want to make a couple comments on what is on the agenda for this evening. And I wanted to specifically comment on the board governance policies of the equity commitment. And I was trying to seek to understand this a little bit better, just because there's so many different definitions for the word equity. And I guess I'm asking you all as board members to be transparent with us as parents as to what the definition of equity is going to be for our district. And I know that we have the equity statement that you all put together and came out in February of this year. But I think that word makes people feel a little bit uneasy just because of the multiple definitions that have been thrown around in the past year and a lot of flabbergastedness, I guess, that has gone into things. And there's been a lot of issues with people getting riled up with that word. And I really don't want that to happen with our school district. And I want to make sure that the students that do need help in our district get that, and that the word doesn't make people go to the extreme and the kids that do need the help don't get the help, if you understand what I'm saying. So I ask for y'all to be transparent with us as parents and what the actual definition of that word is going to be for our district and how that is going to transpose to our students. Thank you so much for your time this evening.
Thank you. We now move on to our reports for the evening. We'll start with Budget Development Committee and Commissioner Harder.
Thanks. The Budget Development Committee has not met since the last normal business meeting that we had, but the two main topics that were sort of in the hopper are remain the referendum and also the holistic sort of ad hoc holistic staff engagement committee. And I don't believe we yet have a date set for the next meeting, but those will no doubt be the main topics.
Thank you. Now move to our legislative liaison, Dr. Johnson.
The U.S. Department of Education on Friday, May 28th, warned Wisconsin that the proposed $350 million for the state's rainy day fund would not help qualify it for $1.5 billion federal stimulus funds for education. The GOP budget already puts at state at risk of losing out on. If Wisconsin fails to qualify, the funding would revert to the federal government to be reallocated to other states that do qualify to receive the funds. Wisconsin is eligible to receive $1.54 billion in one-time federal dollars ESSER III COVID relief funding for its public K-12 school under the American Rescue Act plan. In addition, Wisconsin is eligible to receive $686 million in federal ESSER II COVID relief funding for its public K-12 schools under the Consolidated Appropriation Act. However, to receive the federal funding under each of these acts, Wisconsin must meet a maintenance of effort requirement. The amount of additional state funding needed to meet this requirement is an overall $387 million. On May 26th, the president of the state Senate, Senator Chris Kapinga, Republican Delafield, in comments reported by the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, said there is not much support in the Senate GOP caucus for increased state funding for schools, in part because of the one-time federal coronavirus relief funding that we're on risk of not receiving. He also discussed the idea of consolidating Wisconsin's 421 local public school districts into 72 county-wide school districts to save money. On May 19th, Governor Tony Evers announced that the Public Service Commission of Wisconsin will launch a round of broadband expansion funding in 2 weeks with $100 million in funding from the Federal American Rescue Plan Act. At the request of the Department of Public Instruction, the U.S. Department of Education has granted Wisconsin a waiver from accountability provisions under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. According to DPI, this means Wisconsin will not be identifying new schools as comprehensive, targeted, and additional targeted support and improvement schools, but will be carrying forward last year's identifications. It also means schools will not be held for accountability purposes to a 95% test participation rate, as well as other academic indicators. School quality or student success indicators are progress towards meeting long-term goals and measures of interim progress. The participation rate waiver was not a complete waiver of the test administration requirements. On May 10th, the Federal Food and Drug Administration granted Pfizer's request to authorize the use of its COVID-19 vaccine to children ages 12 to 15. This follows the FDA's actions earlier this year approving emergency use authorization of the Pfizer vaccine for adolescents 16 to 17. Thus far, the Pfizer vaccine is the only vaccine to have been approved for those under age 18. 12 to 18 is the range. On May 4th, the Senate Education Committee recommended passage of Senate Bill 182, a bill to return local school board control of the start date beginning in the 2022-2023 school year on a unanimous 7-0 vote. The Wisconsin Association of School Boards supports local school boards having sole authority to establish the school calendar and supports repealing existing state statutes restricting the school start date. Also passing unanimously out of the same committee were companion bills, Assembly Bill 162 and Senate Bill 177, to change the payment of equalization aids to 4 equal installments, 25% each in September, December, March, and June. Previously or currently, it's 15% in September and 35% in June. This would be phased in by increasing the September payment by 2% and decreasing the June payment by 2% each for the 5 years. On May 3rd, a federal judge presiding in the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Wisconsin ruled that Wisconsin's middle school and high school and 2 different school districts did not violate students' First Amendment rights by enforcing school district codes that were interpreted to prohibit clothing that includes images of firearms. In both cases, depictions of firearms weapons were banned regardless of the viewpoint of the intended message, whether pro-gun or anti-gun. In addition, while both students who challenged the restrictions were told that they could not wear certain clothing and were also required to cover up or remove shirts that included images of firearm, the schools neither disciplined nor further sanctioned the students. Under the specific facts of the cases, the judge ruled in favor of the school districts and upheld the enforcement of the school dress codes, concluding that there was no violation of the students' freedom of speech. The State Department of Health Services post-vaccination guidance for schools says fully vaccinated people with exposure to someone with COVID-19 do not need to quarantine if they have not had any symptoms of COVID-19 since the current exposure. Teachers, staff, and students who are not fully vaccinated should continue to follow current quarantine guidance after exposure to someone with suspected or confirmed COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the superintendent's consent agenda. Both consent agendas the board considers with 1 vote without discussion. Each of these items have been either discussed at a previous meeting or has been provided information previously. Tonight's superintendent consent agenda includes human resources employment report, authorization to executive directors for summer months, 2021-2022 open enrollment applications. I would hear a motion to approve the superintendent's consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Maida, just for clarity, will you please run a roll call vote?
Commissioner Harder,
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson,
Yes.
Commissioner Lyons,
Yes.
Commissioner Nordine,
Yes.
Commissioner Bika, Commissioner Clements.
Yes.
Thank you. We'll now move on to the board's consent agenda. Items on the board's consent agenda tonight are minutes of board meeting May 17th, 2021. Minutes of closed session May 17th, 2021. Changes to governance policies OE2 equity commitment, OE3 climate commitment, OE6 personnel administration, and GC9 process for addressing board member violations. I would hear a motion to approve the board's consent agenda.
So moved.
Second.
Maida, once again, if you would please do a roll call.
Commissioner Harder,
Yes.
Commissioner Johnson. I'm sorry, I didn't hear a response.
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Lyons,
Yes.
Commissioner Nordine,
Yes.
Commissioner Bika,
Yes.
Commissioner Clements.
Yes.
Thank you again. We'll now move on to our focus on results. I will turn it over to Superintendent Johnson and his team.
Thank you. I will transition this to Executive Director of Teaching and Learning, Jim Schmidt.
Good evening. Tonight will be our 3rd effort at focusing on results through the board's new coherent governance model. As I mentioned in our last 2 meetings, collecting and reviewing district-wide data through the pandemic has been a challenge. And then we will have more rich and current data sets from a district perspective when the school year is over. And I'm happy to report that moment has arrived. Tonight, we will focus on our early learning data. The Director of Early Learning, Heidi White, will focus on data from the learning environment itself, social emotional learning, literacy, and mathematics. She will also discuss 2 important curricula the early learning program uses to help develop the whole child. Additionally, like past meetings, there are additional data materials available to the board in board docs. I know the board recently discussed visiting Prairie Ridge. It is an amazing experience when you see a highly skilled adult leading students there. To the untrained eye, purposeful play, which takes place over a large portion of the learning time, seems quite simple. When observers understand how it is properly implemented, they realize the magic that takes place there every day is quite intentional and purposeful. I'm happy to introduce Heidi to share her early learning story with you now.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
We can't, thank you.
Okay, I don't think my camera's working, but,
Right, we can't see you right now.
okay. Sure. Let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, so good evening. I'm happy to be here tonight to share information and data regarding the ECASD Early Learning Program. I'm here representing the amazing staff of the Early Learning Program. They are an incredibly special group of educators who work extremely hard. Our program consists of the Prairie Ridge Early Learning School and 18 community partner sites that provide 4K programming. This year has been a very different year for us. The data you see from the 2020-2021 school year is based on 68 instructional days due to our cohort model this year. Children still had the same amount of hours as a regular year, but attended 2 7-hour days per week and then had 5 days off in between. In terms of learning at this level, children need frequency, intensity, and duration. We still had the same intensity and duration, but what we missed was the frequency, introducing and repeating learning activities and concepts on a daily basis. So over 4 days, 2 days instead of 4 days. Assessment of young children is unique. We share with families 3 big ideas regarding assessment. First, all children grow and develop at different rates. This makes differentiation and individualization extremely important at our level. Second, our focus is on growth. We take children from where they are and help them grow in their development and learning. And last, all assessment at this level helps teachers plan for appropriate instruction. One of the key pieces of data we use at the early learning level is from our environment. The learning environment is critical for young children. The materials, toys, and interactions provide an intentional environment in which children explore, play, and in turn learn. The top score in each one of these areas is a 7. These are our scores over the past several years. Please note that not all sites were able to have an observation due to the COVID shutdown in 2019-2020, and we were not able to do observations this school year. A few scores to note: our language and reasoning scores are at a 6.2 out of 7 across all of our programs, and interactions scored a 6.5 out of 7. These are very high scores. Our overall program across all of our sites is a 6 out of 7. Our lowest area is personal care. The main reason for this score is hand washing. And so it's a work in progress, hand washing with 3 and 4-year-olds, even during a pandemic. So the data from year to year helps us plan for needed materials and professional development, and keep the quality across our whole entire program. The next set of data come from our social and emotional assessment, the Devereaux Early Childhood Assessment, or DECA. Please note that the vast majority of our children we have in our program for 1 year. So when we look at our data over the years, we are specifically looking at the growth the children make over that year, and at our curriculum and high impact strategies over years to make sure they are having the effect we want them to have. The first area is initiative, the child's ability to use independent thought and action to meet his or her needs. You'll notice that we do not have spring scores from the 2019-2020 school year due to the COVID shutdown of schools, and you'll see this pattern throughout the presentation. Specifically with initiative, you'll see an increase in typical and strength scores each year. Our goal is to have 80% of our children score in that typical or strength area. Our data also shows an increase in children showing a strength in this area from 17-18 at 13.5%, to 18-19, 19.5%, and 20-21, 22.9%. Next is self-regulation. Self-regulation is the child's ability to express emotions and manage behaviors in healthy ways. This is mostly done in our program through direct instruction of 5 steps to self-regulation and through co-regulation with a trusted adult. You'll notice a steady increase in strength and typical over the years from 2.7 to 4.6 to 6.5. Our strength percentages increase as well from 12.6 to 17.7 to 18.6. One of our high impact strategies at this level has been the implementation of conscious discipline. This philosophy states that the adult has to be regulated in order to support the regulation of the child. We have learned about brain states and how to provide strategies and support to co-regulation for our students in each part of the brain. Attachment and relationships measures the child's ability to promote and maintain mutual, positive connections with other children and adults. You can see that we show increases each year. This year, you can see the result of our focus on building relationships with our students, even with physical distancing and mask wearing at the preschool level. The strength increases each year again from 13.8 to 18.1 to 18.4. Total protective factors takes into consideration all of the protective factors I just mentioned. I'd like to specifically highlight the strength increase over the years from 12.8 to 23% to 27.1%. Building resiliency in young children is foundational to our program. We work hard to build social and emotional foundational skills for our children's future success. The next graph is behavior concerns. For this graph, please note that we don't have a strength in this area. What we're looking for is a low percentage of need and a high percentage of typical in the area of behavioral concerns. One of the ways we disaggregate data at this level is by groups. This particular graph is of self-regulation. We feel that self-regulation is one of the gateway skills of our program. Our goal is to have 80% of our children score in the typical and strength range by the end of the year. So this graph shows growth in all groups from the beginning of the year to the end of the year. And this is just data from this school year, 2020-2021. So you can see the groups are all above 80% except for one. So we have the early learning program as a whole, Prairie Ridge, Head Start at Prairie Ridge, and then special education children with an IEP. So our overall graph shows that growth. The early learning program shows a 5.6% growth, Prairie Ridge a 10.9% growth, Head Start 9.2%, and special education of 4% growth. Next, we're going to jump into literacy data through our phonological awareness literacy screening, or PALS. Please note that PALS uses spring developmental ranges for pre-K. Again, our goal is for 80% of our students to be meeting developmental ranges by the end of the year. So this first subtest is name writing. So you can see kids make a lot of growth throughout the year in terms of name writing and fine motor. And we work hard to implement Handwriting Without Tears, which is a program that's implemented pre-K through second grade in the district. And then we are also implementing SMART. And that I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit, but that works a lot on fine motor as well. Next, we have uppercase alphabet recognition, and we consider the subtests under alphabet recognition as gateway skills for our students. So over the years, we show a 30% increase in all years in this area, and this is based again on the PALS developmental ranges for spring. Since the developmental ranges for pre-K represent minimal competency, our leadership team researched how many letters children should know before going to kindergarten. We monitor both the developmental ranges, and we've set an ECASD benchmark of knowing 20 uppercase letters. So you'll note we have more work to do to get these levels at 80%. Okay. Please note that during the 17-18 school year, our percentages for lowercase letters are extremely high. PALS directions state that children need to reach a threshold of 16 letters before being assessed for lowercase letters. Our leadership team did not feel like we had a good handle on what our children actually knew. So the graph from 17-18 only shows the percentages of those children who were tested. We worked with Michelle Radke and PALS to get permission to remove the thresholds and test all children on lowercase letters and sounds. So you can see we have some work to do in terms of the spring developmental ranges. And then the next graph will show you based on the ECASD benchmark of knowing 16 lowercase letters. So again, you'll see we have some work to do to get all groups to 80%. The next 3 subtests you'll see are all based on the spring developmental ranges. So you can see that we've shown consistent growth over the years in letter sounds. Oops, did I not do this right? Okay. So sorry, this is based on PALS developmental ranges. We've shown consistent growth over the years from 43.2 to 50.3 to 52.3 in terms of developmental ranges. And then based on our ECASD benchmark, we would like them to know 10 sounds before moving on to kindergarten. So you can see, again, we've got some work to do in that area. Beginning sound awareness is next, and this is based on spring developmental ranges. So you can see that kids show significant amount of growth throughout the year, and we have met that 80% in beginning sound awareness, and that's a picture sorting game. That's part of the assessment that they do. Next, we have print and word awareness. Again, this is based on spring developmental ranges, and you can see we've met that 80%. And really working with kids on those book handling skills and basic print awareness. And then we have rhyme awareness. And again, these are based on spring developmental ranges. So you can see we're hovering around that 80%. This particular graph is disaggregated by groups in letter sounds. And we feel letter sounds is one of those gateway skills that we're really looking at our growth in. Our goal is to have 80% of our children score in the typical and strength area by the end of the year. Using this data, our leadership team noticed that this was really an area that needed work, and how is our instruction going to look different for these groups? Specifically, engaging ways to learn letters and sounds. We are implementing SMART, stimulating maturity through accelerated readiness training, and Orton Gillingham to provide multisensory and movement activities that are appropriate, fun, and engaging for young children. Next is Teaching Strategies Gold, and the next few slides I'm going to show you are some math data, our math objectives. We worked as a leadership team with Michelle Radke and TSG to establish end-of-the-year benchmarks. We want 80% of all students to be meeting the benchmark at the end of the year. So we have reached this with the objective of counting. And counting includes rote counting, counting 5 to 10 objects with one-to-one correspondence, and stating the last number in all to tell how many. We've been inching our way to 80% in the area of quantifying. Quantifying includes recognizing and naming the number of items in a small set, combining and separating up to 5 objects, having awareness of more, less, and same, and attempting to count on to find out how many. Connects numerals with quantities. This includes identifying numbers 0 through 10 and connecting each numeral to counted objects. And then next is understanding spatial relationships. This is the language part of math. And so we created a common assessment for all of these math objectives in 17-18 to ensure consistent marking of this objective. Because as you can see, each objective had several different things to measure. And so we wanted to make sure that as a program, we were consistent. And so you can see that this is scoring very high, and I think that's a direct result of having that common assessment and the consistency. And then last, we have understands shapes, and shapes has children name and describe basic shapes. Many children can name shapes but have more difficulty describing them. So last week, this topic came up again at our leadership team meeting as we were reviewing our data. Something we're going to come back to and look at our benchmark and look at our assessment to see if there's changes that need to be made in this area. So I've given you a lot of quantitative data, and I wanted to give you a little bit of qualitative data from our staff regarding the couple of high impact strategies I mentioned, so conscious discipline and SMART. So some impacts on staff. Becoming aware of my state as an adult allows me to have empathy and positive intent for students, offer shared control through choices, and see behavior as an opportunity to teach a missing skill and not punish. Staff are using conscious discipline themselves. This has significantly improved their ability to approach behavior situations with students much more calmly. It has helped their own mental health and has taught them not to take student's behavior personally. The understanding that during misbehavior, I can and should move into a closer connection with a student rather than withholding connection is so much more successful with students. And in terms of impacts on students, when children can predict that any oops is met with empathy, now we are on a path to regulate. What I see in the room is that children are on the path to regulate because our room allows the flexibility and acceptance. I see a change in how my students interact with each other. They are much more understanding and can see through loving eyes. This only happens when the children see each other as a school family. And SMART gives children fun, safe, and controlled movements that have significantly improved their ability to stay calmer and more regulated. This has resulted in better focus throughout the day and more engagement on learning tasks and social interactions. SMART has increased attention and engagement with students. The movement activities are challenging and easily intertwined with academic learning. So again, when you think about our program and having our children, the majority of our children for 1 year, sometimes it feels like we're planting the seed and we don't always get to see how that seed takes off. Like elementary schools get to follow those kids through 5th grade. So a lot of times we feel like, we are planting the seed. We've done a lot of work studying the early brain and developmentally appropriate ways to build that brain. And SMART and conscious discipline focus on the brain and learning readiness skills so we can provide our children with the best preschool experience so they'll be ready to move on to kindergarten. Some next steps for us include breaking down that group data and just a focus on Tier 2 supports. What groups aren't as successful and what can we do about that? What does intervention look like at pre-K? But we also want to make sure that we maintain a balance between assessment and our interactions with kids, scaffolding, higher level questions that we ask them. We want there to be a balance between that. So that concludes my presentation. So I'll open it up to any questions for Jim and I that you might have.
Thank you, Heidi. We know that pre-K early learning is some of the most impactful learning that children ever receive. So thank you for sharing with us the results and the work that you're doing across the system at Prairie Ridge and all of our partner sites. Questions or comments from the board? Dr. Johnson.
First of all, I appreciate the report that was written and provided to us beforehand. Very detailed and informative. Ms. White, I'm curious, as you see these improvements from fall to spring, do you also have an idea of like how much time is like spent on each of these elements throughout the day by your educators with these students? I'm just curious, is there like a temporal component? So you, if it's that conscious discipline, there's an element of conscious discipline that we spend this amount of time on during the day and then we move on to something else. Is there do you guys have an idea of how much time is spent in the course of a day working on certain elements?
So we do have a pacing guide. So we wanted to make sure that consistently across our program, no matter what site your child went to, they were getting a very consistent experience and high quality experience. The interesting thing about preschool is that, and Jim can attest to this because he's been in some of our classrooms recently, it is integrated throughout. So when we talk about conscious discipline language, yep, we have a like a 15 to 20-minute lesson a couple times a week, but then we hear that language constantly. We're reinforcing that language. Conscious discipline says that you have to practice a social skill 2,000 times in context, in a social context, to be able to use that skill and know that skill. And so really it's, we do have very specific, like, you know, times for our lessons. It's usually with our pre-K kids, a large group lesson would be maybe 10 minutes tops, 10 to 15 minutes, especially at the beginning of the year. But then you'll see specifically that some of those same objectives that we're trying to get, you'll find that there'll be specific activities and toys set up in the room intentionally so that we can review that skill again and again for kids that need it, and as many times as they need it. So a lot of it's very integrated, and especially next year when we go back to a 3.5-hour day, when you take away all of the just the custodial cares, meals, snack, preschool children go to the bathroom a lot, they wash their hands a lot. Just those transitions, it really narrows down that instructional time. So we have to really make every minute count. That's why you'll see things for instruction by the bathroom. You'll see it in the gym. You know, you'll see it at mealtime where we're having conversations. So a lot of it is very integrated, but there are specific pacing and lessons for each curriculum that we use.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question.
Other comments or questions? Commissioner Clements.
Thank you for your excellent report. As we see these, one of my questions often is, what disaggregated data do we have to examine how we are progressing towards our goals of equity for those who are of various backgrounds, and how we are serving our students as they progress through their educational journey? Is that data available for this program?
Yes, we've looked at our data lots of different ways. We've narrowed it down again by these groups: boys, girls, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, Head Start. And then we've done a little bit of risk ratio data, but really over the past few years, we've really tried to work through our universal level and making sure that our universal curriculum and assessment are consistent across all sites in our program. And so those, that disaggregated data, we've done some in big groups like I've showed you, but really, like I said, our next steps are looking at, okay, so of these groups, whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's race, which ones aren't performing as well as others and maybe aren't quite as successful, and then what can we do about it? What are the implications for instruction? So we do have that, but it's something that we're really just starting to delve into in terms of this level, because we've spent a lot of time just figuring out what is it that we want all kids to know. How do we keep a balance between having, you know, too much assessment at this level? And then, you know, kind of like I said, our next steps are really going to be digging deeper.
Dr. Bika.
And just to echo others, thank you, Ms. White. Excellent report. I appreciated both the quantitative and the qualitative data. And I know this is new for all of us as we change over to a new governance model, but I'm wondering if there would be interest or an opportunity that you would come back and share those disaggregated data with us, or thinking about next year when we look at the data, if actually the report could be focused in that direction. Just go ahead and go right into that information, kind of letting these kind of these more global data just pass by, assuming that there is increase of strike momentum.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I think that's definitely doable.
I have one more thing to share also about the program design itself. The pre-K program for ages 3 is only the Head Start students, so there's a couple classrooms in the morning, a couple in the afternoon in a normal year. Of course, this year was a little different. They were 2 classrooms for 2 days and then another 2 classrooms for another 2 days. But the 4-year-old Head Start, which is a poverty-driven program, those students are integrated with all other 4K students, so they are not segregated. So part of the intentionality of the program is to try to ensure that we support those students in that context that Heidi was talking about. And the conscious discipline she was talking about. So, for example, and Heidi kind of alluded to the fact that I was just out there for a visit recently, and we had a student had a collision with another student, and typically, that raises lots of eyebrows and what are we going to do? And boy, that teacher did not miss a beat. Kept everyone's dignity intact, really used this calming language and reinforcing. And the students come in those settings from a mixed background that we typically see, like Prairie Ridge is one of our higher poverty schools in the district. It is the second highest poverty elementary school in the district. If you compare them to the other 13 elementaries. And so the intentionality of that program is actually pretty neat because it's trying to ensure that you provide those supports and context rather than isolating students out. That being said, that would be a really good next step to look at the data in the right from the get-go next time around in terms of how the equity strategies are actually working for students in that context.
Dr. Johnson?
Yeah, Ms. White, could you, do you know offhand, or could you just provide an estimate? What is the student support ratio for our students with disabilities in the pre-K setting compared to what they would be once they get to the K-5 setting? Do we have an idea of what those student support ratios are, given the fact that I assume those students already have an IEP in place? So I'm just curious in terms of what's the student support ratios, is it higher or lower that happens in a pre-K setting versus what would be potentially provided to them once they get to K-12?
One of the differences with our program is that we, based on requirements, have a teacher and an assistant in each classroom. And with our 3-year-olds, the highest number we go to is 15, and with our 4-year-olds, it's 17. And we usually start out the year with not a very high special education ratio because a lot of times this is their first, unless they're in birth to 3, this is their first experience in school. So we do a lot of preventative work to avoid special education or IEPs. And we do have one intensive classroom that has kiddos that need really intensive therapies or just really need additional supports. And there's very few students in those, maybe 3 to 4 in each classroom. And then we do have, at Prairie Ridge, we have 3 SEAs. And then we have basically 3 special education teachers that meet the needs of the kids in our building. And then we also have SPED teachers that provide services in our community sites or in the homes of children as well. So I'm not sure of the exact specific ratio, but I know that as class sizes get bigger when they move out into kindergarten, there is a need for, additional support staff. But I don't know, Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I don't know.
I don't think so. I couldn't quite hear all of your question, Commissioner Johnson, so I'm not sure if I'll add to that answer or not. But let me know if you need clarification. So when we look at allocating adult support to any level, it's based on individual needs. So it would be really looking at each student and then allocating the amount of support that that student needs. And then the SEA support is allocated to buildings in that way. So that ratio is going to look different in every building and every classroom because it's based on student needs.
Seeing no other comments or questions, just say thank you, Heidi, for being here tonight. Thank you, Jim and Mandy, for adding additional insight to the process. We'll now move on to monitoring district results. Tonight we have the first draft of a monitoring report. Just for a little bit of introduction, the board will remember that we planned these first drafts into our work schedule for the year because this is the first time that the district is going through the development of monitoring reports for all of our operational expectations and results policies. And so tonight, Superintendent Johnson will share with us OE1. OE1 and R1 are not actually full monitoring reports. They are commitments from the district and the administration, the board and administration affirming the generalized principles. So tonight we won't have markers or data, but there still are interpretations of the policy that the board has written that the superintendent will make. And again, just by way of a second, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Johnson to share those interpretations with us. But remember that our role in this is to evaluate, district adherence to operations and success in moving towards the results that we've asked for. For OE1 and R1, we'll simply be affirming that yes, we maintain that we want this to be the district's operating overall global operational expectation. And when we get to interpretations of these, the board's responsibility is to, as is laid out in BSR 4, respect and support any reasonable interpretation of the superintendent's of its policies by the superintendent, even though superintendent decisions may not be the decisions of the board or its members. And so as we go through some of these interpretations, maybe not tonight, but certainly there will be in the future, there may be a time where we as individuals would not approach it that way. But if the interpretation is reasonable, I just want to remind everybody from the get-go, our job is to allow the district to interpret as long as that's interpreted. Not knowing and wanting to practice that communication that we spent a lot of time talking about, having this first draft will allow the board to have some of that communication. If there is an interpretation that the board overall feels is unreasonable, we can act as a group to vote and say we think that's unreasonable, please work on that. But we can have that discussion and that communication before the full report comes back next time. And this will be then kind of the ongoing process. So for all of these, we'll have those. At this time, I'll turn it over to Superintendent Johnson to talk to us about his interpretations on OE1.
Thank you and good evening again. As Dr. Nordine prefaced, I'll discuss my interpretation of OE1 with the global operational expectations and examples of prominent areas and departments. I discussed this with other superintendents and researched what other districts in this board governance model have addressed regarding OE1. My main influence has been Dr. Brad Sarin, superintendent of Sun Prairie Area School District. I've been able to speak with him on multiple occasions over the past weeks. He's been extremely helpful in his past position as a former superintendent in Chippewa Falls when they adopted this board governance model some years ago. As Dr. Nordine stated, the global OE1 is not monitored, and as we don't build overarching guidance on what to do with this, and there are no monitoring reports, the other OE policies 2 through 14 for our district will have more detailed and comprehensive coverage and monitoring. But we established the coverage and monitoring for our other OE policies. It's not without accountability, however, but this policy allows us as a district to be agile to adapt to situations and not create policy on the fly, so to speak. We can't proactively express how to respond to everything as situations do arise, especially in the situation like we've experienced with COVID. We must ground ourselves in OE1 in what's delegated to the superintendent and her or his administrative team. For example, a decision like where to put new solar panels or a controversial partnership with a chamber of commerce. Again, these are simply examples, not real situations. That would allow for accountability, but yet overarching responsibility to cover the situations to make decisions in a fluid nature. Of course, informing you as board commissioners as not to surprise you beforehand. So thank you for Marissa for advancing to the next slide. To start on slide 2, this overarching policy connects and aligns with all areas of the strategic plan. On the third slide, my first interpretation of this OE1 policy involves the following. This expectation holds the superintendent responsible for a system of continuous quality improvement, communication with district partners and stakeholders, and a consistent commitment to achieve measurable success in our policies. These 3 items are addressed in the following bullet points on the 4th slide, and I'll illustrate those briefly. For the first, information on continuous quality improvement. We must constantly analyze and align our systems of quality improvement to benefit our students, staff, and community. I must be responsible for examination of our accomplishments and difficulties in analyzing all types of data, where it could be achievement data, response or survey data, and whether recommendations are provided or not. Sharing that data with the stakeholders as well as the measures to improve data in the celebration, and yet answering the why of positive data or negative data is paramount to this and builds trust in our organization. For example of that bullet point, an example would be continuous quality improvement in the human resources realm, where we must increase our retention rates from year to year. From a diversity and equity lens, we want to see more increase of diverse candidates interviewed, hired, and retained across the district. We must solicit feedback from our employees. In this type of survey would originate from Michelle Radke's office. Every employee gets an exit survey if they're leaving. For the second bullet, communication with our district partners and stakeholders. In addressing this one, as mentioned before, soliciting feedback from district partners and stakeholders through our focus groups and surveys is key, as well as sharing that data, as is key in our results and OE policies, as we've started to demonstrate at the end of May with our elementary screening data and middle school achievement data and tonight's early learning. Again, it must be widely public, and our stakeholders will appreciate the why answers in explaining successes or difficulties in achieving our results. For example, various stakeholder groups in our teaching and learning department have been surveyed with exit tickets, Google Forms, or Qualtrics methods, depending on the focus group and type of meeting, so it informs our continuous improvement efforts. The third bullet, in commitment to achieve measurable success, the examination of data and follow through to own it is critical. The term, we treasure what we measure, is sometimes utilized, and now through our new board governance model, it's more important than ever, where we focus on the measurement, the results, explain the why, and commit to our progress, improvement, growth. This is true in all departments, not just in teaching and learning, where there is standardized testing data to report. There are also areas in all other departments, like finance, for example, where we're audited, and then there are recommendations provided to improve our system and practices. Our next slide is the second half of my interpretation of the policy, where the expectation holds the superintendent accountable for following board policy, state and federal law. It is broad in scope and holds the superintendent responsible for ensuring the district operates in a legal, safe, and ethical manner. So the next slide and the points below are articulated as follows. Accountability for following board/district policy, state and federal law. Another example from finance, from a purchasing standpoint. Competitive bids policy and process. Abby Johnson has shared, then she shares with Scott Knofke. Most people use their P card, they review. We must be diligent about P cards. For example, is the invoice attached, signed, and what was the communication? So then when finance staff imports that P card information, we look for purchases used over $3,000, new vendors as well. Then from accounts payable, we look for the account number, budget authority approval, account numbers, and authority to approve that invoice and code it. Unfortunately, as many of you know, we have examples of fraud in our community and even in other school districts. Therefore, we want to safeguard. The second bullet point in this second half of the interpretation would be examples of the review process, especially in following district policy. You know, we've had discussions at the executive team level that will soon be shared with our system leaders when finalized. In the past, there were at least 8 groups or levels to this district policy review process, our 100s and above, yet not including a WASB review, consultation with Steve Wells' office, or a principal update. However, we have it down to 6 items before it's formally reviewed by the board. For example, we have a policy review committee. We have an executive director or departmental review when that policy goes to those requisite people. Then third, an equity steering committee review to have that equity lens. Then principals would be informed of updates. Then back to a policy review committee final review. And if no more edits are necessary, a final legal review with Steve Well. Then, and after further discussion, will ensue an agenda setting, I would anticipate tomorrow to the board, determining that consent agenda or action item, as different districts accomplish this very differently when it goes to the board. The third district responsibility component, the superintendent's work, legal, safe, and ethical. In speaking with Dr. Sarin, this is where I'd like to quote him. He mentioned this district responsibility is, quote, the superintendent's work, unquote. It's to really ensure that we're operating in that legal, safe, and ethical manner. There are so many examples in discussing with the executive team in a variety of departments. For example, in student services, it's an area where there are safety-related reports and protocols. Specifically, we have to be responsible for suicide protocols, other items, bullying and harassment, non-discrimination, for example, OCR complaints. There are pieces that need to be examined, investigated, submitted. HIPAA with student data, child neglect and abuse, mandatory reporting situations that we maintain and update. And there are a couple more, including Title IX and sexual harassment reporting. So many responsibilities, and that was just, for example, in the student services realm. There are the legal, safe, and ethical. For teaching and learning, for example, I've been provided with over 30 reports that we need to provide to DPI and other departments as well. So there's a tremendous amount of responsibility with these. At this time, that's my brief. I wanted to take anywhere between 7 to 9 minutes. I'd like to allow the board to comment on this interpretation, possibly some questions. Dr. Nordin, I will transition over to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Superintendent Johnson. So certainly, we don't have data that we're going to ask for. The first drafts, when we go to the full monitoring reports, this would be a time where we could talk about where Superintendent Johnson would have said, these are the data that I'm intending to bring to help show whether or not we're in compliance with this operation or succeeding on this result. And it would be a time for, if there was something that the board felt was missing or wanted to see, would be a chance to ask that before the monitoring report fully came in. In this case, it's comments and questions about the interpretation, and certainly it's open also for board discussion because we need to decide about for ourselves. And that's actually how it probably will work next time. But comments and questions from board members, either for us to discuss or for Superintendent Johnson.
So a point of clarification for me.
Go ahead, Dr. Johnson. Thank you.
Point of clarification for me. So the reasonable measure understanding, is that in consultation with the board, or is it the superintendent brings that and then there's discussion of whether or not this is reasonable, and or neither one of those happen? We have to what we're brought, and then we just say it's not reasonable to a degree, and then this is what would make it.
The superintendent is charged with making the interpretations and empowered to make the interpretations. However, if the board finds those interpretations unreasonable, the board is the arbiter of whether or not it is reasonable and can ask for a readjustment. But the board is not responsible for making the interpretation or saying this is what it means. That is the superintendent's responsibility. But then we decide, are the interpretations reasonable? Eventually, when we're in the other operations, we'll decide for ourselves how the superintendent will provide us with a statement of in compliance, right? In compliance with exception or not in compliance. The board will then take the report and then we'll discuss among ourselves. Do we agree with Superintendent Johnson? We will decide for ourselves whether or not we like what we want to have as and for the results, it's very similar. It's, making reasonable progress towards these results, making reasonable progress with noted exceptions, or not making reasonable progress, and the board decides that level. For the interpretations, again, it's the superintendent's responsibility to make the interpretation, and as long as Superintendent Johnson makes a reasonable interpretation, then it's our job to accept them. We had a lot of discussion in the building process about whether or not to include description of the reasonable person standard here, but that was sort of the basis of that. I think that hopefully clarifies at least what the roles are.
Yeah, thank you.
Commissioner Lyons.
So this is going to come out as a statement. It's really more of a question, and I'd kind of like to hear, because I'm articulating my understanding of this first operational expectation, which as I'm grasping it, it's a very broad capstone kind of expectation that meanders into many of the other operational expectations in calling upon the superintendent to establish measurements that go throughout a number of the OEs, including, you gave an example of finance and OE 11, financial administration. So that's how I'm understanding the superintendent's interpretation as I listen. Is that correct?
That is correct, Commissioner Lyons.
Thank you.
In my and to add to that, Commissioner Lyons and the rest of the board, in my conversations with Dr. Sarin, Dr. Heidi Eliopoulos from Altoona, and then in communication with other districts and examining their policies with OE1, it came down to just very broad, overarching with R1 and OE1. And where we really get into the detail and the monitoring and the targets would be in our district OE2 to OE14. And that's where my study and my focus has been over the past few weeks. Dr. Sarin has been a very willing participant to assist. The day after, just about every superintendent in the state reads the Wisconsin educational updates and news. And once he learned we've gone to this board coherent governance model, he called immediately and said, whatever you need, just please let us know. So, with Maida Miskey, and I've contacted obviously Dr. Sarin and others, but been very, very helpful. He was one of the first people who had reached out. So, that's where we're gleaning from. When Dr. Nordine shared this original Google Doc with us back in October, I believe, looking at those 5-6 districts, 4 of them in state and 2 of them out of state, to examine this. And that was, this was very similar to what they had proposed in their documents too. And it's just very interesting. Chippewa Falls has been in this model for a while, DeForest and some Prairie, very established. So it's very nice to hear from other superintendents where it's been successful for them and just trying to replicate that.
Dr. Pika.
I have a question about 2 things that are included in the definition of terms. My first question is about the definition of the word unsafe. And I wonder what you would think about, or would you consider expanding that to psychological injury as well? So to physically injure, what would you think if that was to physically or psychologically injure?
No, thank you for that question. Had used that from other districts as well, and I see no reason, especially given the events of the past year and a half, why that could not be included. So I have noted that. Thank you, Dr. Bika.
My second question is about discriminatory. I think the definition is a great starting place. I wondered what you would think about including more of, or basing the definition in prejudice and oppression. So I think we would expect different students or groups of, we would expect students, individuals or groups to be treated differently. But maybe to highlight that if you're engaging in unjust or prejudicial treatment.
Yes, thank you. I would definitely consider that as well. I also think with our equity statement, to make it more parallel with that too, where that I think that could be included to make sure that those definitions are parallel and consistent throughout our system.
Other comments, questions, or discussion? So for next time on the agenda, we will have, this will be for the July meeting, we will have OE1 as a monitoring report again. At that time, Superintendent Johnson, you will probably have a briefer presentation since this is such a compact report anyway, but especially if there are any updates to definitions or interpretations, we'll share those. At that time, then the board would vote to accept the monitoring report from the superintendent, at which point it becomes ours. We would discuss amongst ourselves, what will we do with this? In this case, the vote will be to affirm OE1. In the ones that have the rating system, then it would be something that we will vote. We would accept, we would talk about it, and it could be one of those three things for the OEs, right? In compliance with exceptions, or not in compliance. But for this next one, because it's just an affirmation, the same thing for R1. But beyond those two, then that will be the process. For next time, for this particular item, it will probably be relatively quick because there aren't monitoring reports, and we've had a chance to talk about the interpretation in the first place. Seeing no additional comments or questions, we will move on to our final, well, not our final agenda item, but our final potential action item for the night. It's matters reserved for board action. In this case, the employee handbook modifications. This is for OE6, in which the board specifically reserved employment changes to the handbook for its own action. So I'll first turn it over to Kay Marks for the presentation.
Thanks, Tim. Good evening, everybody. So tonight we're going to go through the employee handbook modifications as we do annually right around this time. And this year we had a unique year because of obviously the pandemic and everything that surrounded that. So this year our Employee Relations Committee, which is the group that meets annually around a whole litany of things, determined early on in the year that the work of the Employee Relations Committee was going to be pared down significantly because a lot of the work that the group normally does was already being taken care of just because of the pure nature of what was happening in the district. So the group determined early on in the fall that the only thing that the committee was going to take on was going to be the handbook changes this year. So you can see on the slide in front of you that the timeline for the work of the committee was modified to only look at handbook language modifications. And you can see that in terms of the work of the actual committee and what we bring the committee together for, the first time that the committee came together to look at modifications was meeting with the ERC on May 6th. All of the work, yep.
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you. We don't actually have any slides on our screen right here. I know I can see some of the screens of other commissioners that we have it up on our personal computers, but we're not seeing a slide in. So I'm sorry to jump in, but I thought if anybody doesn't have it up, or those just watching from home.
Okay, so Maida or
Okay, do you have the option to share your screen?
Yes, I thought that I did hit share my screen.
I wonder if the ball was still passing at the time. Let's try it again.
You tell me what I need to do.
Do you have the pop-up or the little window at the bottom where you can select share and then share screen?
Let me try this. I have my share button that says share content.
Okay. Is share screen one of the options?
No.
Marissa is going to try to pull it up quick.
Okay.
And then you can just tell her to advance.
That's so disappointing. We did a little tutorial, Maida and I, so that we could make sure that this worked just the right way.
We tried really hard.
We did. Maida gave me an A when we did it earlier this afternoon.
Okay, I can now see Marissa's screen.
Perfect.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so are we all set? Can everybody see Marissa's screen?
Yes, we're ready. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Tim, for letting me know. So the work of the ERC, we came together on May 6th so we could share with them the recommendations that had been brought together to that point in time. We gathered information from that group on the input that they had for what we had compiled up to that point. They provided us some modifications and suggestions on different things. You can see here that we kind of sent them off and shared information with them. They took what we did together as a group on that day and gathered more input, shared information, excuse me, with other members of their employee groups, and then gave us that feedback again back to our department. We took that, made modifications that were shared with us after the input that was gathered from employees. And then we had the final information that was shared back with the ERC by May 21st. That input was vetted by the district's attorney. And then obviously tonight we're sharing that information with all of you, the school board members. Next slide, Marissa, please. So you can see here that the process that the employee handbook routinely takes is that modifications are made on one or more of the following reasons. Either it's a new policy or practice that needs to be added to the handbook. We're adding language that matches a practice that's been ongoing and has been in place, but the language needs to be updated. We look to clarify an existing policy or practice because something comes up throughout the year that leads us to think that the language isn't quite clear enough for employees to fully understand what the information in the handbook is trying to say, or we need to delete language because the information is no longer applicable for whatever the reason may be. So, Marissa, if you could go on to the next slide. So we have 16 different modifications to share with the board. And the information that's part of the employee handbook modifications that we shared with everybody, there's 14 pages, but that information is to provide context and information rather than just pulling out a small little segment of a one line that's changed. So we provide a large chunk of the information that's in the handbook to be able to provide context to the reader so that you understand what is fully being changed in the employee handbook. So in the information that Marissa just pulled up for us, thank you, Marissa, we've identified these in 16 different modifications, and then highlighted them in red so that it's easy to determine which is the actual modification. So the first part is applicable to part 1 of the employee handbook, which is for all employees in the school district. So it's not broken down to employee group. So part 1 is for all employees. And you can see that the first modification has to do with updating language to match current policy and practice. And if you scroll through, you can see the colors in yellow and turquoise. And the yellow is what struck out, and the turquoise is the color that's being replaced. I will apologize for letter D where it says level A2. The 2 is a typo. I believe that just happened in some formatting that we were looking to do, and that piece got missed. So my apologies. But basically, this is just updating the seasonal wages that we pay when we have seasonal workers that come in during the summer. Number 2, again, still in the section that pertains to all employees. This is adding language for new policy or practice. If you recall back in earlier in the year when we presented the school year calendar, at that point in time, Jim and I talked about inclement weather days and emergency school closure days and what it would look like going forward now that we have virtual learning at our fingertips. And at that point in time, we had indicated to the board that we would be looking to do all inclement weather days with a component of virtual learning. At that point in time, the board wasn't comfortable with that. They asked us to go back and do more research and conversation around other options for that. And so there is a group of individuals who are working on what that can look like for next year. However, with everything that was going on this school year, it was just really too challenging to be able to get folks together to have a true conversation about what that could look like and any options for that during the school year. So we will have to come back to you with this piece because there just needs to be some time now that school has finalized to be able to bring that group together and have some honest conversations about realistically what that component could look like. So I wanted to make sure that that piece didn't get lost. So this is just a holding place to say this piece will come back to the board after the committee has a chance to meet and have some honest conversations about that. Number 3 is updating language to match the current policy. So several years ago, we changed out the personnel file system in the Human Resources Department to an electronic system. And there was still some old language that didn't apply. So this is just updating that to indicate that the process now is electronic and how that piece can, how employees can go about accessing a copy of their file and what the process actually is. Number 4 is adding 2 different pieces here, adding some clarifying language and then actually talking a little bit about a new practice or policy. So letter C is finalizing kind of the last group of employees that are moving to time cards and moving to completing electronic time cards within moving to all time cards and not being paid hourly employees being paid as salaried employees. So this is the last group that's being moved to that. We've been phasing that in over the past couple of years. And then letter A is just clarifying that now school year certified employees will be the only group left that has that option to be paid over the 10 or the 12-month time periods. So that's letter A in number 4. Number 5 is just clarification to let people know that sick leave and personal leave do not get paid out when you separate from employment. The only thing that gets paid out when you separate from employment is vacation days if you have earned them and not used them. So it was just to add a piece to clarify that. Number 7 is brand new language. There isn't anywhere in the handbook that we account for this. Excuse me, because up until this past year, we hadn't actually really experienced this. So I know you've all had a chance to read this. And we really felt that we needed to be proactive in having some language that addressed remote work, considering that many employees just came off of a year and 3 months of working remotely. And we didn't want to, throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, nope, you can't work remotely at all ever again. When we've been able to say that for certain positions, this obviously has worked for some situations. On the flip side, now that we've gotten to the point, like the community member said in public comment, where the community is at a point where things are much healthier than what they once had been, the need to be able to have to work remotely isn't what it was when we were all working remotely. But we still want to be able to be proactive and have some language that accounts for the parameters of when this can be done. If there are circumstances where it needs to happen. So we still want to provide those parameters. Again, like I said, this has been vetted by the attorney. And so, the language is here if we need to use it. And as we go forward, we'll monitor this significantly to make sure that it's being used with the intention that the ERC group was hoping it was going to be used for, to provide options. And we'll just have to really watch it closely to make sure that it's being used with the rightful intentions. Number 8, this piece gets into something that I wanted Abby to talk about, because as Abby explains the piece related to retirement, this goes back to some provisions that the board acted on previously. And once Abby explains that piece, as we go through the remaining modifications, it will be a lot of referring back to, yes, this change reflects back to what Abby had explained earlier. So Abby, if you wanted to speak to this piece.
Sure, thank you, Kate. So if you remember our work from 2019, those of you board members that were on at that point, we had several conversations and presentations about OPEB. And so in July of 2019, there was a presentation from Dan Wilson and I related to work that the ad hoc committee had done. And there were probably, I think, 12 or 13 items that were shared with the board on that date. On August 5th, the board actually had the opportunity to vote on those items. And so the changes that are reflected here is the item that was related to the district contribution. So for those of you that are new, and as a reminder for the rest of you, currently if an employee retires, they get the higher of the district contribution in the year of retirement or the year after retirement. And the committee had reviewed that and recommended that there should be, the district contribution should be the same as the year that they retire instead of the next year, because as we know very well, health insurance typically goes up and not down. And since that district contribution is tied to the insurance piece, the committee felt comfortable making the recommendation to have the cap or district contribution set at the date of retirement. So the application date and the first date that goes into effect is July 1st, 2021. And so that's why you are seeing this multiple times through the handbook changes tonight, because this handbook begins on July 1st, 2021. At the same time that change goes into effect.
Thanks, Abby.
You're welcome.
Number 9, this has to do with expanding opportunities for our hourly staff. Previously, we had, well, many years ago, had made changes and had to limit the opportunities for hourly staff to be able to have our incremented positions, which would be any coaching opportunities or advising opportunities, where they'd be able to work with students after school in incremented positions. And we're now going back and revising that and saying that, yes, now we are going to allow that. What this language does in terms of the extracurricular volunteer agreement That document basically explains to the employee that there isn't a direct nexus between, say, I don't know, coaching track and being the GSA at Longfellow. And so there isn't a direct nexus between those two responsibilities, and therefore you wouldn't take the time that you work as a GSA and include that with the hours that you work as the, I don't know what example I just gave, the track coach, and combine those all together to count toward, you know, your hours worked in a week and then toward overtime. So that extracurricular volunteer agreement is a document we've used for several years that we have through our attorney's office. And so now we will use that same document with a few tweaks to be able to open that opportunity back up for our hourly staff to have those experiences working with our students after school. Modification number 10. Again, this goes back to what Abby had described. Number 11 is just updating title changes to different job descriptions. Many of this you may have seen in the job description and labor market review information that came to you previously. Modification number 11, again, is the information that Abby described. Number 13 is a combination of the information that Abby described, and one piece is a little bit more in that under this first chart in section 501, all of the information struck out in these first two grids. Because the director of buildings and grounds and the director of food nutrition, there's only one person in each of those positions. The benefits that were applicable based on hire date, neither of those benefits are any longer applicable based on the fact that people in those positions weren't hired prior to those dates. So those benefits will never be applicable to those positions going forward. So we needed to strike those out. Other than that, the benefit piece all has to do with what Abby had already explained, but the board had modified, and all of the position changes in terms of titles all go back to just updating job description titles based on everything you've already seen in labor market review. And then everything in number 14, these are positions that moved to the hourly group. I want to say the last time that we did the job, or sorry, the modifications, and this was a piece that was missed and didn't get moved. Number 15, again, goes back to what Abby had already shared with us. And then number 16 has to do with the athletic coaching portion of the handbook. And again, this ties into what we just got done talking about expanding opportunities for our hourly staff, and then just changing some language from assistant coaches to athletic coaches. And that takes care of all 16 modifications. Is there any questions that I can answer for anyone?
Thank you, Kay, and thank you to the committee for reviewing these. I know from conversation before the meeting started that there will be some questions, so I will open it to those questions now. Dr. Johnson.
A couple of things. Is it possible, are we to assume that everyone will know what level A is? So is it possible to have a hyperlink to level A? Or will employees automatically know what that level A is and know where the potential salary range is automatically?
Oh, for the beginning of the
level
for the seasonal work?
Yeah, at the bottom of page 1. I think it's just interesting to go for B, for A and B, there's a significant amount, and then for the remainder ones, it's just a level, and maybe people are supposed to know what that level is, or where can they find it to a potential hyperlink, if possible.
Sure, not a problem. Great idea, thank you.
And then if you could, if you could scroll down to, I have to number 7 about the remote work. So I've read this like multiple times, and so there are certain positions, but then in third paragraph, those few positions. So if it's few of certain, can we just identify those? I'm just kind of curious as to what that would be. And then the other thing that I'm troubled by is that second paragraph specifically, which says employees must receive written approval in advance of working remotely. What's the time frame? So is it a day? Is it, what's a time frame in terms of approval? And I don't know if written, more than likely it's via communication, probably email correspondence. But so those, could we identify what those certain positions are? Because I think it's clear to me that within our system, some individuals have more of a ability to work remotely than others. So then what are those? And then so everyone else would know that this remote work option is not even available to them. And if it's just so few, I don't see why there's an issue of just not listing what those few are. And then that second piece about the written approval in advance, there should be a time frame, unless the time frame is somewhere else where you request things in advance. Is that spelled out somewhere else?
So, okay, a couple of questions all embedded in there. So I think the first one, in terms of paragraph 3, approval for remote work will be limited to those few positions whose duties, tasks, and other work obligations do not require the employee to be physically present in the district building, and as a result do not require additional staffing, including the use of substitutes or significant imposition on other employees. So I think the problem with listing it out is that for the positions that this would, originally when we talked about this at ERC, the idea was to not put this in the section of the handbook that applies to all staff, because we had from the get-go ruled out teachers, because obviously if the kids are, if we're not remote for, the whole district, the idea was, teachers should be in front of kids, and that we wouldn't have this as an option for staff members if students were in school. So ERC originally thought that this wasn't even going to be applicable to the certified group, because it was their understanding that teachers wouldn't be eligible for this option. But then when we talked about it outside of the ERC meeting, and we talked about it at exec team, we're like, well, but the certified group contains more than just teachers. There are coordinators, and there are other positions. I don't know off the top of my head. Nurses, psych, social workers, whose positions don't require a substitute, and they don't have to be in front of students all day. Where if something came up and they couldn't physically be in the building, but we wouldn't want them to necessarily stop working, and they had the ability to work, it might be in the district's favor to have this as an option than to say, yep, we're going to forfeit a day of work because you can't physically be here, even though we would like them to continue working. So that's why we left it in the section for all employees. The other piece about that, in terms of listing the positions that it would apply to, is that depending on the time of year and the workload for a specific position or department, at some times of the year, it might be okay for this to happen, and at other times it might not be, depending on what that supervisor has going on in the department, or for that particular person. They may say, no, this isn't a work at home, I need you to physically be here to be able to get these things done. And if you can't physically be here, then no, I would need somebody else to take that over, and it would be somebody else in the department. So that would be the, significant imposition on other employees. So staffing, for example, I wouldn't get a sub to come in for a day to do staffing, but if somebody couldn't be here, it would be additional work on everybody else in the department. So again, depending on the time of the year, the things that are going on, I think it would be challenging to list out all of those positions because I think that it would change based upon that piece.
Yeah, I mean, could you just speak to the written approval in advance? Is there a time frame? Can you do it the morning before? Can you do it a week before? What's approval in advance? Like when does the approval have to happen?
And I think that, again, that'll be case dependent. If it's something where, because we talked about this as well, and it might be, you know, if the morning of and somebody in Jim's department is texting or emailing to say, hey, I need to, you know, stay home to monitor whoever, they have a fever and they can't go to school, but I'm totally capable of working, versus knowing that, I don't know, you're laid up with, I don't know, a cast of some type and, you know, it's February and you can't get around and you know that you're going to be laid up for the next week. So in one case, you have the advance notice to work with your supervisor to say, hey, here's the situation. This is what it looks like. So in that situation, you would know well in advance to be able to have things planned out. And in another, it's, you know, the spur of the moment. The key is making sure that you're working with your supervisor to make sure that, one, it's approved, and two, that they're aware of it. And then from the human resources standpoint, it's our department working with supervisors to make sure that things are happening the way that the policy is intending. And again, it's going to take a lot of oversight to make sure that it's working the way that it's intended. And if it turns out that it's not, then we'll have to revisit it and either tweak things or just say, yeah, it's all good intentions and maybe it didn't work the way that we really thought it was going to. We're trying to provide some options for people.
Dr. Johnson, did you have additional questions on other items before we move the floor on to Commissioner Lyons?
No, sure.
Okay. Great. Commissioner Lyons.
Thank you. I'd like to learn a little bit more about the athletic coaches and the hourly role that that folks can have. When I read that policy, it was confusing to me because head coaches to me are also athletic coaches. So these are all coaches that would work with the athletic director that are non-head coaching. Is that correct?
Phil, I just want to make sure that I'm looking at the right spot. Are you on number 16, the very last one?
On 16, yes. And it says head coaches should work with the athletic director to hire athletic coaches. So that does not include the head coaches.
Correct.
Okay. So there's multiple levels of assistant coaches that you're trying to clarify that it's all athletic coaches that are not a head coach.
Did you say it's all athletic coaches that are not head coaches?
Yes.
Right. So the head coach works with the athletic director to hire athletic coaches. I think that, and Kim, you might know a little bit about this as well, but I think the clarification here is that in the past, like way back, you know, you'd have your head coach and then an assistant coach, and then maybe the freshman coach. And as the years have gone on and it's gotten harder to find coaches who are able to commit to as much time as it takes to do some of these positions, coaches and head coaches and athletic directors have ended up taking, you know, what used to be one assistant coach position and have had to divvy that up into perhaps 3 different positions.
Yes.
Because you can't find one person to commit to the expectations of that one assistant position. So they might divvy it up into 3 because they can find 3 people who can give, you know, 1/3 of the time, but they can't find one person to find, you know, to be able to give 100% of the time. And so
you have those three individuals and two of them are exempt and one's non-exempt. Do they all receive the same compensation?
yes,
Okay, so the exempt would receive stipends and the non-exempt would receive hourly wages divided into that stipend. And then when the hour amount runs out, then they're done as a coach. Is that, how do you maintain equity with compensation for those folks?
Abby, could you speak to that?
Yeah, I turned on my camera because, Phil, that's a great question, and that's part of the reason for this change and the change earlier about the increment of positions. So we thought that was the road that we would need to go down for hourly employees to figure out how many hours, fit into that slice of the increment or that increment. And in speaking with our attorney, what we learned was their interpretation of FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act. There had been a change to say that coaches are considered teachers. And so because coaches are considered teachers, they look at that as an exempt position. And so we can use that piece of it and that interpretation of the FLSA for that specific coaching role. And so they would, so as case example, with 3 people taking a piece of the increment, all 3 of them would get the same and it would be paid just like a regular coaching increment would be paid.
So the non-exempt people would be paid by stipend?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I would like to also go to number 7 that Commissioner Johnson was discussing. I don't know who's on the ERC, but I was wondering, have the system leaders seen this? And what I'm interested in is in consistency in those supervisors on that case-by-case basis, having consistency within decision-making. So within that instructional example that was being used, if you have 2 instructional positions and one is approved and another is not approved, is there criteria by which one supervisor can say yes and another can say no? Because I think people are going to see inequity in that.
Thanks for that, Phil. Yes, so we haven't, there are administrative reps on the ERC. There's reps from every employee group other than food and nutrition, and we don't exclude them. They have a hard time finding anybody to be a rep simply because the meetings are after work hours and their work hours end a lot sooner and earlier than the time of the meetings. And so for years, we've struggled to find somebody to be on the committee from food and nutrition, but otherwise there are reps from all of the employee groups that are on the ERC. So we did talk about that and agreed that it will take a lot of training about what it looks like to be in an approved area so that there isn't inconsistency about that, because that happens on a regular basis in the district. Somebody says that yes to something at Roosevelt and no to something at Mans. And then in my communications with Mark Goings, the ECAE president, then I was like, well, how come this is happening? And there's inconsistencies. And so we've really worked hard over the years through my work with Mark to be able to identify where those big gaping holes are with inconsistencies, and have worked from, like you said, a system leader's standpoint to be able to kind of hone in on that. And this will be one of those areas where it's going to be significant that we're crystal clear on that, to make sure that people are aware what can and can't happen with this new policy.
I think maybe some detail needs to be added to this section, because exempt and non-exempt staff would be eligible for remote work. And with an exempt staff member, a salaried staff member, I think it's much easier to maintain than with a non-exempt, where with wage and hour laws, we'll need to be able to know the hours that they've worked, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it just seems like there ought to be a little bit more detail, from my opinion. And then I have one more kind of comment, and I'll pass it on. I'm sorry for taking so long. So I was one of the board members that expressed some concern about the emergency closures, the snow day policy. And it seems to me that it's a much bigger issue than something that belongs in the employee handbook, because it's not only impacting employees, it's impacting students and parents and really the entire district, from my opinion. And just last month, May 6th in 2021, there was an op-ed in the New York Times about don't do away with school days. And it was written by a parent who talked about, you know, my daughter isn't going to learn anything on a day when you're closing school, and she knows it's a snow day. But what you would take away from the online instruction is that memory and that good feeling about having that time off. So just as a board member, I feel like I'm not sure that policy belongs here. I think it's a much bigger issue. It was a board policy, policy 723. And I think it might be a standalone in and of itself, because I know it was in the calendar, and I know here now we're talking about it within the employee handbook. I think it probably has tentacles all over the place. So I wonder if it's not something that's even outside of this.
Thanks, Phil.
Yep.
Any other comments or questions on changes, the proposed changes to the handbook, before we move to potential board action? Hearing none, I think the way that I'd like to approach this is basically through Robert's Rules of Order. What I'd like to do is start with a clean motion to approve the proposed changes. At that point, we can potentially offer amendments. I know, and we can vote on those individually. When we get to the end, we can vote on the whole as it stands and go from there. Because I think even if, we've had, Commissioner Lyons, you just expressed some reservations about the emergency school closures one. That probably doesn't mean, though, that you feel we should reject all of them. So I think if that's acceptable to everybody, that's how I'd like to go through this for our own efficiency. And I know we're just running a tiny bit late, so I think that will help. So if I could first hear a motion to approve the proposed changes to the handbook.
Motion. Second.
Commissioner Nordine, I'm sorry, may I chime in for a moment?
Yes, please. Maybe I've gone off the reservation here.
This item was noticed on the agenda as a report because historically we've heard the presentation of the modifications at a meeting and then added them to the consent agenda the next meeting. So I'm just a little nervous that we did not notify the public that even though it's under matters for board action, that's just because we don't really have a good spot on the agenda for this type of report right now.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that. So then what we'll do is we'll just close it here. We've heard some discussion and we've had some questions. So Kay, if you want to consider what the board has said here, and if you or the ERC or whoever would want to bring back any adjustments for next time, that's fine. We will probably have to have it as a separate, I'm seeing some nods from colleagues, as a separate reserved for board action item as opposed to consent, so that we can go through this amendment process if need be. But yeah, then I feel fine doing that as long as my colleagues are okay with that as well.
Sounds great. I think procedurally, if it's supposed to, as a report, and then go to the consent agenda, procedurally, then during the consent agenda, we would someone would have to just pull it for consent.
Sure. We don't have a procedure that says it has to go to consent. The assignment to consent or, an individual item is really just a board decision. So yeah, you're right. That is all that would have to happen, but I'm just noting from the comments that I'm sensing it would probably get pulled anyway, as it stands. There, like I said, I would think most of them are fine because we didn't have any, discussion, but if that's okay. All right, well then, thank you, Kay, for that. We'll look forward to talking about it at the next meeting as an item, and we can go through that process that we outlined here at that time. So then at this time, we'll move over to our board debrief. This is where we get a chance to talk about what we as the board feel went well and what we could improve on. Again, as the focus is on our performance as a board, it's our own self-evaluation as opposed to the evaluation of a given report or something like that. But Commissioner Clements, I believe you were the third member at the last agenda setting, so I will turn it over to you to lead our round the horn.
Thank you, Dr. Nardi. So following in Commissioner Lyons, kind of setting the tone in terms of how we try to discuss our self-improvement and reflection as we work towards the end of the meeting. My initial reflection is we're starting to try to feel our way through how our agendas are even designed and how we work through our new governance model. And I anticipate this is going to continue, but it's my initial reflection is clear to me that we're still working through some of these things. And I think that's good that we're having that discussion as we try to learn this. And I'd like to ask board members how you feel that we did tonight in terms of approaching some new things in this governance model, including how do we take action on something and how it's on the agenda.
So following Commissioner Lyons' example, I think we're waiting for you to call on us so that we can go. But if you'd like to do it a different way, you're welcome to.
I'm just going to start with Dr. Bika. You've been quiet for part of a lot of the evening, so I'm interested to hear how you think the meeting went.
Yeah, sure. I think it was successful. I think when I see how tonight went, I can see meetings of the future, like I can see them unfolding. So it's a great beginning.
Yeah, so I think the thing that I appreciate tonight is our taking some time to discuss more amongst ourselves. And that's something that we need to be doing, especially as we start to think about how is the district heading, how is our monitoring coming out. So I was glad to have those opportunities to answer a question back and forth between ourselves, which has not been a process. In terms of doing things better, it is figuring out what is the system, where do we go. So thankful to you, Maida, for being here to catch me when I'm going one direction without thinking, and I look forward to improving my own performance as the current president in that, but also just board performance of knowing how do our meetings unfold and how do we address each of these things as they come up.
Johnson?
Yeah, I still have a lot of uncertainty, about heading in this particular direction. I think for me, as long as there are opportunities to discuss, express concerns, and not feel that you have to quote unquote move with a sense of urgency, I think my acclimation to the process will go a little bit smoother. But still, there's a lot of uncertainty and uncomfortability. But I'm here. Interested in learning.
Commissioner Lyons?
So most of the time I try to be very succinct and very to the point with my comments. Tonight I wasn't. I went on a bit. The employee handbook is an incredibly important document. And what I sometimes feel is at the end of as the 9 o'clock hour approaches, some of the meat of what we're doing oftentimes is at the very end of the meeting. And I want to make sure that we give proper attention to things that are really important. And I think we did that tonight, and I'm glad it's going to be on the future agenda. But there are times, tonight was one where I felt rushed because I knew that the 9 o'clock hour was coming, but I had a lot to say. So for my colleagues, thank you for listening to me. Appreciate it.
Commissioner Harder?
Well, yeah, I agree with an earlier comment about how important it is for us to have space to talk as board members between ourselves and knock ideas around. But I guess as a counterpoint, I'm really looking forward to the data in these reports getting into more of a framework of sort of expectation. It's going to take some time for us to get there. But this was a good start, I think, looking at OE1, and you know, the process is really underway now, and I'm excited to see that.
Thank you, everyone. I guess a parting question or comment that I neglected earlier was we're seeing how we're functioning without the committees that we've been used to. So some of the things that we've been presented to us tonight may have worked its way through a committee before it got to the board. And so trying to figure out how we work in that environment where some of these questions may have been discussed before it came to the board and the pros and cons of that. I'm thinking particularly the employee manual may have come up through policy and governance, for example, before, or in some other way that some of those questions from the board members could have been explored. So I'm hoping that as a board member, we can continue to figure that out, because that has been one thing that I'm attentive to, is how do we govern well without that extra engagement by the board that committees provide. Thank you, everyone, for your reflections.
Thank you, Commissioner Clements, for running it for us tonight. That is the end of our meeting. So at this time, I would hear a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
This program was brought to you by a cooperation between Newsworks and the Eau Claire Area School Board.